The Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation, tr.Federal'naya sluzhba bezopasnosti Rossiyskoy Federatsii (IPA), is the principal security agency of Russia and a main successor agency to the USSR's Committee of State Security. Its main responsibilities are within the country and include counter-intelligence, internal and border security, counter-terrorism, and surveillance, as well as investigating some other types of grave crimes and federal law violations. It is headquartered in Lubyanka Square, Moscow's center, in the main building of the former KGB. The director of the FSB since 2008 is Army General Alexander Bortnikov. The immediate predecessor of the FSB was the Federal Counterintelligence Service of Russia, itself a successor to the KGB. On 12 April 1995, Russian President Boris Yeltsin signed a law mandating a reorganization of the FSK, which resulted in the creation of the FSB. In 2003, the FSB's responsibilities were widened by incorporating the previously independent Border Guard Service on a major part of the abolished Federal Agency of Government Communication and Information, the two major structural components of the former KGB that remain administratively independent of the FSB of the Foreign Intelligence Service and the State Guards. Under Russian federal law, the FSB is a military service just like the armed forces, the MVD, the FSO, the SVR, the FSKN and EMERCOM civil defense, but its commissioned officers do not usually wear military uniforms. Overview: the FSB is mainly responsible for internal security of the Russian state, counter-espionage, and the fight against organized crime, terrorism, and drug smuggling. Since 2003, when the Federal Border Guard Service was incorporated to the FSB, it has also been responsible for overseeing border security. The FSB is engaged mostly in domestic affairs, while espionage duties are responsibility of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. However, the FSB also includes the FAPSI agency, which conducts electronic surveillance abroad. All law enforcement and intelligence agencies in Russia work under the guidance of FSB. If needed, the FSB combines functions and powers similar to those exercised by the United States FBI National Security Branch, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the Federal Protective Service, the National Security Agency, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, United States Coast Guard, and partly the Drug Enforcement Administration. The FSB employs about 66,200 uniformed staff, including about 4,000 Special Forces troops. It also employs about 160,000–200,000 border guards. Under Article 32 of the Federal Constitutional Law on the Government of the Russian Federation, the FSB head answers directly to the RF President, and the FSB Director is the RF President's appointment, though he is a member of the RF government, which is headed by the Chairman of Government. He also ex officio is a permanent member of the Security Council of Russia, presided over by the President and Chairman of the National Anti-Terrorism Committee of Russia. History. Initial recognition of the KGB. The Federal Security Service is one of the successor organizations of the Soviet Committee of State Security, following the attempted coup of 1991, in which some KGB units as well as the KGB head Vladimir Kryuchkov played a major part. The KGB was dismantled and ceased to exist from November 1991. In December 1991, Two government agencies answerable to the Russian president were created by President Yeltsin's decrees on the basis of the relevant main directorates of the defunct KGB, Foreign Intelligence Service, and the Federal Agency of Government Communications and Information. In January 1992, another new institution, the Ministry of Security, took over domestic and border security responsibilities. Following the 1993 constitutional crisis, the Ministry of Security was reorganized on 21 December 1993 into the Federal Counter-Intelligence Service. The FSK was headed by Sergei Stepashin. Before the start of the main military activities of the First Chechen War, the FSK was responsible for the covert operations against the separatists, led by Duzhok Adudayev. Creation of the FSB in 1995, the FSK was renamed and reorganized into the Federal Security Service by the federal law of 3 April 1995. On the organs of the Federal Security Service in the Russian Federation. The FSB reforms were rounded out by Decree No. 633, signed by Boris Yeltsin on 23 June 1995. The decree made the tasks of the FSB more specific, giving the FSB substantial rights to conduct cryptographic work, and described the powers of the FSB director. The number of deputy directors was increased to 8 to 2 first deputies, 5 deputies responsible for departments and directorates, and 1 deputy director heading the Moscow City and Moscow Regional Directorate. Yeltsin appointed Colonel General Mikhail Ivanovich Baskov as the new director of the FSB. In 1998, Yeltsin appointed Vladimir Putin, a KGB veteran who would later succeed Yeltsin as federal president, as director of the FSB. Putin was reluctant to take over the directorship, but once appointed conducted a thorough reorganization, which included the dismissal of most of the FSB's top personnel. Putin appointed Nikolai Patrushev as the head of FSB in 1999. Role in the Second Chechen War. After the main military offensive of the Second Chechen War ended and the separatists changed tactics to guerrilla warfare, overall command of the federal forces in Chechnya was transferred from the military to the FSB in January 2001. While the army lacked technical means of tracking the guerrilla groups, the FSB suffered from insufficient human intelligence due to its inability to build networks of agents and informants. In the autumn of 2002, the separatists launched a massive campaign of terrorism against the Russian civilians, including the Dubrovka theater attack. The inability of the federal forces to conduct efficient counter-terrorist operations led to the government to transfer the responsibility of maintaining order in Chechnya from the FSB to the Ministry of Internal Affairs in July 2003. Putin reforms. After becoming president, Vladimir Putin launched a major reorganization of the FSB. First, the FSB was placed under direct control of the president by a decree issued on 17 May 2000. Internal structure of the agency was reformed by a decree signed on 17 June 2000. In the resulting structure, the FSB was to have a director, a first deputy director and 9 other deputy directors, including 1 state secretary and the chiefs of 6 departments: Economic Security Department, Counterintelligence Department, Organizational and Personnel Service, Department of Activity Provision, Department for Analysis, Forecasting and Strategic Planning, Department for Protection of the Constitutional System and the Fight Against Terrorism. In 2003, the agency responsibilities were considerably widened. The Border Guard Service of Russia, with its staff of 210,000, was integrated to the FSB via a decree was signed on the 11th of March 2003. The merger was completed by 1 July 2003. In addition, the Federal Agency of Government Communication and Information was abolished and the FSB was granted a major part of its functions, while other parts went to the Ministry of Defense. Among the reasons for this strengthening of the FSB were enhanced need for security after increased terror attacks against Russian civilians, starting from the Moscow theater hostage crisis, the need to end the permanent infighting between the FSB, FAPSI and the border guards due to their overlapping functions, and the need for more efficient response to migration, drug trafficking and illegal arms trading. It has also been pointed out that the FSB was the only power base of the new president, and the restructuring therefore strengthened Putin's position. On the 28th of June 2004, in a speech to high-ranking FSB officers, Putin emphasized three major tasks of the agency: neutralizing foreign espionage, safeguarding economic and financial security of the country, and combating organized crime. In September 2006, the FSB was shaken by a major reshuffle, which, combined with some earlier reassignments, were widely believed to be linked to the Three Whales corruption scandal that had slowly unfolded since 2000. Some analysts considered it to be an attempt to undermine FSB Director Nikolai Patrushov's influence, as it was Patrushov's team from the Karelian KGB Directorate of the late 1980s, early 1990s that had suffered most, and he had been on vacations during the event. By 2008, the agency had one director, two first deputy directors and 5 deputy directors. It had the following 9 divisions: counter-espionage, service for defense of constitutional order and fight against terrorism, border service, economic security service, current information and international links, organizational and personnel service, monitoring department, scientific and technical service, organizational security service, fight against terrorism. Starting from the Moscow theater hostage crisis in 2002, Russia was faced with increased levels of Islamist terrorism, the FSB, being the main agency responsible for counter-terrorist operations, was in the front line in the fight against terror. During the Moscow theater siege and the Beslan school siege, FSB's Spetsnaz units Alpha Group and Vimpel played a key role in the hostage release operations. However, the performance was criticized due to the high number of hostage casualties. In 2006, the FSB scored a major success in its counter-terrorist efforts when it successfully killed Shamal Bashayev, the mastermind behind the Beslan tragedy and several other high-profile terrorist acts. According to the FSB, the operation was planned over 6 months and made possible due to the FSB's increased activities in foreign countries that were supplying arms to the terrorists. Bashayev was tracked via the surveillance of this arms trafficking. Bashayev and other militants were preparing to carry out a terrorist attack in Ingushetia when FSB agents destroyed the convoy. 12 militants were killed. During the last years of the Vladimir Putin's second presidency, terrorist attacks in Russia dwindled, falling from 257 in 2005 to 48 in 2007. Military analyst Vitaly Shlikov praised the effectiveness of Russia's security agencies, saying that the experience learned in Chechnya and Dagestan had been key to the success. In 2008, the American Carnegie Endowment's Foreign Policy magazine named Russia as the worst place to be a terrorist, and highlighted especially Russia's willingness to prioritize national security over civil rights. rights. By 2010, Russian forces, led by the FSB, had managed to eliminate out the top leadership of the Chechen insurgency, except for Dr. Umarov. Increased terrorism and expansion of the FSB's powers. Starting from 2009, the level of terrorism in Russia increased again. Particularly worrisome was the increase of suicide attacks, while between February 2005 and August 2008, no civilians were killed in such attacks. In 2008 at least 17 were killed, and in 2009 the number rose to 45. In March 2010, Islamist militants organized the 2010 Moscow metro bombings, which killed 40 people. One of the two blasts took place at Lubyanka station, near the FSB headquarters. Militant leader Dr. Umarov, dubbed Russia's Osama bin Laden, took responsibility for the attacks. In July 2010, President Dmitry Medvedev expanded the FSB's powers in its fight against terrorism. FSB officers received the power to issue warnings to citizens on actions that could lead to committing crimes and to arrest people for 15 days if they fail to comply with legitimate orders given by the officers. The bill was harshly criticized by human rights organizations. Role: counterintelligence. In 2011, the FSB said it had exposed 199 foreign spies, including 41 professional spies and 158 agents employed by foreign intelligence services. The number has risen in recent years. In 2006, the FSB reportedly caught about 27 foreign intelligence officers and 89 foreign agents. Comparing the number of exposed spies historically, the then FSB director Nikolai Kovalyov said in 1996, "There has never been such a number of spies arrested by us since the time when German agents were sent in during the years of World War II." The 2011 figure is similar to what was reported in 1995-1996, when around 400 foreign intelligence agents were uncovered during the two-year period. In a high-profile case of foreign espionage, the FSB said in February 2012 that an engineer working at the Plesetsk Cosmodrome, Russia's main space center for military launches, had been sentenced to 13 years in prison on charges of state treason. A court judged that the engineer had sold information about testing of new Russian strategic missile systems to the American CIA. An increasing number of scientists have been accused of espionage and illegal technology exports by the FSB during the last decade. Researcher Igor Satyagin, physicist Valentin Danilov, physical chemist Oleg Korobinichev, academician Oskar Ibyshev, and physicist Yuri Ryjo, ecologist and journalist Alexander Nikitin, who worked with the Bellona Foundation, was accused of espionage. He published material exposing hazards posed by the Russian Navy's nuclear fleet. He was acquitted in 1999 after spending several years in prison. Other cases of prosecution of the cases of investigative journalist and ecologist Grigory Pasko, Vladimir Petrenko, who described danger posed by military chemical warfare stockpiles, and Nikolai Shur, chairman of the Snezinsky Ecological Fund. Other arrested people include Viktor Orekov, a former KGB officer who assisted Soviet dissidents, Vladimir Gazantsev, who disclosed illegal purchases of eavesdropping devices from foreign firms, and Vilmer Zayanov, who had written that Russia was working on a nerve gas weapon. Counter-terrorism. In 2011, the FSB prevented 94 crimes of a terrorist nature, including 8 terrorist attacks. In particular, the agency foiled a planned suicide bombing in Moscow Moscow on New Year's Eve. However, the agency failed to prevent terrorists perpetrating the Domodedovo International Airport bombing. Over the years, FSB and affiliated state security organizations have killed all presidents of the separatist Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, including Duzhok Adudev, Zelimkhanya and RBF, Aslan Maskhadov, and Abdul Kalim Saidulov. Just before his death, Saidulov claimed that the Russian government treacherously killed Maskhadov after inviting him to talks and promising his security at the highest level. During the Moscow theater hostage crisis and Beslan school hostage crisis, all hostage-takers were killed on the spot by FSB Spetsnaz forces. Only one of the suspects, Enur Pashikulov, survived and was convicted later by the court. It is reported that more than 100 leaders of terrorist groups have been killed during 119 operations on North Caucasus during 2006. On 28 July 2006, the FSB presented a list of 17 terrorist organizations recognized by the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation, to Rossiyskoy Gazeta newspaper, which published the list that day. The list had been available previously, but only through individual request. Commenting on the list, Yuri Sapunov, head of anti-terrorism at the FSB, named 3 main criteria necessarily for organizations to be listed. Foreign intelligence. According to some unofficial sources, since 1999, the FSB has also been tasked with the intelligence gathering on the territory of the CIS countries, wherein the SVR is legally forbidden from conducting espionage under the intergovernment agreements. Such activity is in line with Article 8 of the Federal Law on the FSB. Targeted killing. In the summer of 2006, the FSB was given the legal power to engage in targeted killing of terrorism suspects overseas if so ordered by the President. Border protection. The Federal Border Guard Service has been part of the FSB since 2003. Russia has 61,000 kilometers of sea and land borders, 7,500 kilometers of which is with Kazakhstan, and 4,000 kilometers with China. 1 kilometer of border protection costs around 1 million rubles per year. Export control. The FSB is engaged in the development of Russia's export control strategy and examines drafts of international agreements related to the transfer of dual-use and military commodities and technologies. Its primary role in the non-proliferation sphere is to collect information to prevent the illegal export of controlled nuclear technology and materials. Intimidation of foreign diplomats and journalists. The FSB has been accused by The Guardian of using psychological techniques to intimidate Western diplomatic staff and journalists, with the intention of making them curtail the work in Russia early. The techniques allegedly involve entering targets' houses, moving household items around, replacing items with similar items, and even sending sex toys to a male target's wife, all with the intention of confusing and scaring the target. Guardian journalist Luke Harding claims to have been the subject of such techniques. Organization. Below the nationwide level, the FSB has regional offices in the federal subjects of Russia. It also has administrations in the armed forces and other military institutions. Subdepartments exist for areas such as aviation, special training centers, forensic expertise, military medicine, etc. Structure of the Federal Office. Counterintelligence Service Chiefs. Oleg Siromolotov, Valery Pekyonkin, Directorate for the Counterintelligence Support of Strategic Facilities. Military Counterintelligence Directorate. Chiefs. Alexander Bavigny, Vladimir Petrishchev. Service for Protection of the Constitutional System and the Fight Against Terrorism. Chiefs. Alexei Sedov, Alexander Bragan, Alexander Zhankov, German new groom of Directorate for Terrorism and Political Extremism Control, Chiefs, Mikhail Belousov, before him Grafov, before the latter Boris Mylnikov. Federal Protection Service of the Russian Federation, Director General of Army Yevgeny Alexeyevich Murov, President's Regiment in the service of the Commandant of the Moscow Kremlin of the Federal Security Service of Russia stationed in Kremlin, was created on 8 April 1936 as a special regiment for the security of the Kremlin garrison. Economic Security Service Chiefs: Alexander Bortnikov, Yuri Zaostrovtsev, Viktor Ivanov, Nikolai Patrushev, Alexander Grigoyev. Operational Information and International Relations Service Chiefs: Viktor Kimogrov, Sergei Ivanov. Organizational and Personnel Service Chiefs: Yevgeny Lavirov, Yevgeny Solovyov. Department for Activity Provision Chiefs: Mikhail Shekin, Sergei Shishin, Pyotr Perevertsev, Alexander Strelkov. Border Guard Service Chiefs: Vladimir Pranichev. Control Service Chiefs: Alexander Zhankov. Inspection Directorate Chiefs: Vladimir Anisimov, Rashid Nurglayev. Internal Security Directorate Chiefs: Alexander Kupryashkin, Sergei Shishin, Sergei Smirnov, Viktor Ivanov, Nikolai Patrushev. Science and Engineering Service Chiefs: Nikolai Klemashin. Investigation Directorate Chiefs: Nikolai Oleshko, Yuri Anisimov, Viktor Milchenko, Sergei Balashov, Vladimir Galkin. Besides the services and directorates of the Federal Office, the territorial directorates of FSB in the federal subjects are also subordinate to it. Of these, St. Petersburg and Leningrad Oblast Directorate of FSB and its predecessors have played especially important roles in the history of this organization, as many of the officers of the Directorate, including Vladimir Putin and Nikolai Patrushev, later assumed important positions within the Federal FSB office or other government bodies. After the last chief of the Soviet time, Anatoly Kirkov, the St. Petersburg and Leningrad Oblast Directorate were led by Sergei Stepashin, Viktor Cherkasov, Alexander Grigoyev, Sergei Smirnov, Alexander Bortnikov and Yuri Ignashchenkov. Directors of the FSB. On 20 June 1996, Boris Yeltsin fired Director of FSB Mikhail Baskov and appointed Nikolai Kovalyov as acting director and later director of the FSB. Alexander Bortnikov took over on 12 May 2008. Criticism of FSB political role in Russia. The FSB has been criticized for corruption and human rights violations. Some Kremlin critics such as Yulia Latinina and Alexander Litvinenko have claimed that the FSB is engaged in suppression of internal dissent. Litvinenko died in 2006 as a result of polonium poisoning. A number of opposition lawmakers and investigative journalists were murdered in the 2000s while investigating corruption and other alleged crimes perpetrated by FSB officers. Sergei Yushchenkov, Yuri Shekotcherhan, Galina Starovoitova, Anna Polikovskaya, Alexander Litvinenko, Paul Klebanov, Nadezhda Chaikova, Nina Yefimova, and others. The FSB has been further criticized by some for failure to bring Islamist terrorism in Russia under control. In the mid-2000s, the pro-Kremlin Russian sociologist Olga Krishtanovskaya claimed that FSB played a dominant role in the country's political, economic and even cultural life. FSB officers have been frequently accused of extortion, bribery and illegal takeovers of private companies, often working working together with tax inspection officers. Active and former FSB officers are also present as curators in almost every single large enterprise, both in public and private sectors. Former FSB officer, a defector, Alexander Litvenko, along with a series of other authors such as Yuri Felshtinsky, David Sutter, Boris Kagarlitsky, Vladimir Pribilovsky, Mikhail Trepashkin, claimed in the early 2000s that the 1999 apartment bombings in Moscow and other Russian cities were a false flag attack, coordinated by the FSB in order to win public support for a new full-scale war in Chechnya and boost former FSB director Vladimir Putin's, then the Prime Minister, popularity in the lead-up to parliamentary elections and presidential transfer of power in Russia later that year. In his book Mafia State, Luke Harding, the Moscow correspondent for The Guardian from 2007 to 2011 and a fierce critic of Russian politics, alleges that the FSB subjected him to continual psychological harassment, with the aim of either coercing him into practicing self-censorship in his reporting, or to leave the country entirely. He says that FSB used techniques known as Zersetzung, which were perfected by the East German Stasi. Konstantin Preobrazhensky criticized the continuing celebration of the professional holiday of the old and the modern Russian security services on the anniversary of the creation of the Cheka. The successors of the KGB still haven't renounced anything. They even celebrate the professional holiday the same day as during repression. On the 20th of December, it is as if the present intelligence and counter-espionage services of Germany celebrated Gestapo Day. I can imagine how indignant our press would be. Quote, in the same time, in 2007, during a memorial to the victims of the 1937 Great Purge at Butovo firing range, Vladimir Putin honored the victims of the Stalin's Purge and told the audience that the Great Purge was prepared by the years of the previous hostilities of the Soviet regime, including extermination of entire strata of the society, clergy, Russian peasantry and the Cossacks. In his speech, Putin mainly criticized the Red Terror under the lead of Felix Dzerzhinsky as the then Cheka head, which resulted in the deaths of thousands, including opponents of the regime and the clergy.